The SS Alkimos has been known as a cursed ship since its inception. The ship was launched during World War II when ships were being pushed through the production line at amazing speeds. Corners were cut and the ship was ailing from the start. There were even rumors that the ship was being completed so quickly that the welders in the hull were sealed and slowly died there. The dead welders were just some of the accidental and fatal rumors that plagued the SS Alkimos' short burrow. Once when he went out to sea, his damn reputation just continued. It was originally called George M. Shriver before it was changed to Viggo Hansteen. After commissioning on October 11, 1943, it was plagued by technical difficulties. The ship often breaks down. In August 1944, the ship's mortal history had another chapter when a brutal suicide took place. The ship was in the port of Naples when a crew member shot and killed a Canadian radio operator before shooting himself. After the war, the ship changed hands before it was finally renamed the Greek ship SS Alkimos. The ship was followed by bad luck and technical difficulties, as well as ghost stories. In 1963 the ship ran aground off the coast of Western Australia. The propeller was damaged, so efforts were made to tow the ship to Fremantle for emergency repairs, before moving it to Hong Kong for major repairs. In Fremantle, the ship inexplicably caught fire when it was finally ready to tow to Hong Kong. The tow rope broke and the ship ran aground again, this time north of Fremantle. In an effort to keep the ship going, caretakers were left on the ship until proper efforts could be made to salvage it. Caretakers reported feelings of being watched, smells of cooking food coming from the galley, and a great feeling of unease while on board. Efforts to salvage the ship failed as one company after another tried. In one attempt the ship that was trying to tow out the SS Alkimos caught fire, causing the SS Alkimos to run aground again. This time it was left where it was. Plans were made to demolish the ship, but the man in charge died in a plane crash. Anyone who attempted to destroy the ship met with misfortune. All efforts have been abandoned and the ship remains there to this day. The ghost plane is one of the most common ghost stories in World War II because it was a war that filled the sky with planes, showing how the biggest and best planes revolutionized modern warfare, so it's no surprise that people continue to do so. They reported that they could see and hear planes in the sky long after the war. But some stories are unexplainable, even if there is evidence to support them. The Dark Peak area tells many stories of ghost planes. As we all know, more than 50 plane crashes have occurred here over the years. One of the ghost planes was seen over England. This is not a strange ghost or anything else caused by post-war stress. Most likely it happened in 2015 when they saw a World War II plane flying on the Dark Peak in North Derbyshire. The area is famous for ghosts and airplane sightings, which is why the area gets its name. In 2015, several witnesses saw a World War II aircraft flying over the bomber. As determined by the former Royal Air Force pilot familiar with the appearance of the Y aircraft. A member of the Royal Air Force identified the aircraft as Lancaster, a heavy four-engine bomber used by the Air Force during the war. Another pilot disagreed and thought it was a Liberator, an American small four-engine bomber. Another witness thought it was too small, being Lancaster, but added that it has antennas and is camouflaged. The plane never landed, and there are no regular flights from Lancaster or the Liberators historical aircraft. Bombers are not the only ones operating in the area of ghost planes were seen. There were more reports of ghost plane sightings in 2017. This time, several people reported seeing Douglas in Dakota. Aircraft operated by the Royal Air Force during World War II have now ceased to serve. Witnesses said there was a problem with the plane and flew directly towards them. Witnesses said the plane turned and disappeared without a trace. Historical records confirm that the Douglas Dakota crashed in the observation area in the 1940s. On a cold day in November 1944, the air defense crew stationed in Belgium noticed a large aircraft approaching them. The Royal Air Force identified this aircraft as the American B-17, the so-called Flying Fortress. The observation was strange because the landing gear was pulled out, the aircraft was approaching quickly, and there was no plan to land, so people on the ground thought the aircraft was making an emergency landing. They were right, but the reason for landing was an emergency. They didn't expect it. The plane landed and looked almost intact. The landing was uneven and flexible, and the people on the ground knew that the whole situation was wrong because the plane almost cut off the wings before it came to a stop. After waiting for 20 minutes in the open space, no one approached the plane. The team went out to explain what had happened. Eventually the people on the ground were worried and decided to approach the plane, although the engine continued to make a huge roar. The door opened, and the silence on the plane was louder than the roar of the engine. There is no occupation. No one was found on the plane, but there is evidence that the organic crew was on the plane recently. There were candy bars and a navigation code book with the color of the day in the middle, indicating that the organic crew was found on the plane. What is more mysterious is the carefully wrapped parachute enough to leave the entire crew intact. No matter what happened, it seemed at first glance that the crew disappeared completely and the plane landed on its own. Although it seemed like a strange ghost story at first. It spread throughout the entire army in this way, but it was much simpler. The plane was shut down and shot down, rendering the plane unable to fly. The crew tried their best to lighten the burden and then got off the plane. The B-17 descended to Brussels. The engine problem seemed to be solved. The B-17 flew alone, but could not stay in the air without the engine running and landing. This was seen by the Royal Air Force crew. The Bowington Tank Museum is located in Dorset, southwest England. The museum provides fascinating insights into the history of tanks and has the largest collection of tanks in the world. More than 300 tanks from 26 countries are displayed, including the British Mark tank from World War I, which is the oldest main battle tank in existence. Given that many of these tanks were left after bloody battles, it is not surprising that many of them have dark stories associated with them. One of the most famous ghost stories in the Bowington Tank Museum is the story of a ghost nicknamed German. It is said that Hermann once chased Tiger 131, a German Tiger I heavy tank captured by the British during World War II. It is now the only active Tiger in the world. The tank claimed that when it was brought to the museum for the first time, the body of a German soldier was found inside. Now every night there are rumors that a ghostly bloody hand comes out of the tower and screams are coming from the tank. Many museum employees and visitors reported that a man in a German uniform from World War II ran around the tank. Observations on the museum floor have become so frequent that this ghost is called Hermann Nemitz. It is believed that he was a resident of the tank and may have died in it. There is another explanation for this story. It may have been invented by museum curators to prevent teenagers and vandals from visiting the museum. The disappearance of cultural relics in the museum is unusual before the frequent reports of sightings surfaced. But even after the museum reported that the German Hermann could only be a story invented to protect the museum, these observations also reported that other parts of the museum were moving, hearing footsteps, or feeling observed. Balls considered to be indicators of perfume can often be found in photos taken in museums. With so much happening at Clark Hospital in the Philippines, it is considered one of the most haunted places in the world. Nat Geo TV made the location a part of their I would not go there because the hospital was part of the US Air Force Base in Pampanga, which was controlled by the US Air Force from 1903 to 1991. The Air Force Hospital as part of the base is being abandoned. During the Second World War, the base will become a stronghold for the upcoming anti-Japanese war. The US military dispatched a large number of planes to the base to attack Japan. However, most of these aircraft were destroyed only 9 hours after the Pearl Harbor attack. The base was occupied by the Japanese in 1942, and as part of the Bataan Death March, American prisoners of war were forced to walk through the once hospitable gates of the base. It was rebuilt in 1945 to take care of American soldiers before they were sent home. It became a base of operations during the Cold War and the Vietnam War. According to reports, the hospital itself was also used as a hiding place for American soldiers, adding color to the story of restless ghosts. There are reports that when soldiers swallowed their last breath or were under Japanese occupation, voices and screams echoed in the dark corridors, but it was not just the sounds and lights that made many people think Clark Hospital was the most haunted place in the world. 1. The base has been looted by the locals, which only adds to the gloomy feel of the place. To make matters worse, there are reports that the ghosts in the hospital are far from friendly. People have enough courage to cross the road. The door report left trash, and they seem to be everywhere. Angry screams can be heard, warning uninvited guests not to explore the hospital and its ghostly residents. With so many reports of ghost sightings, noise and even violent attacks, few places are as scary as Clark Hospital. The blue benches outside Queen's Hospital in London are for people with bruises and broken dreams. The colorful paint scheme warns the locals that maybe they should find another way to protect them from the terrible reality of war and save the terrible reality. The disfigured young man carried another kind of fear, another kind of embarrassment. Soldiers sitting on these benches during and after World War I suffered facial injuries on the Western Front that they had never seen during the war. The explosion of metal grenades and shrapnel tore the flesh, tearing apart the faces of those who dared to lean on the trenches or avoid machine gun shots. The sky is full of broken iron. Usually, the first person to come into contact with this broken iron is the human face. If the soldiers are not killed immediately, the survivors may be disfigured, said Dolan Carding, the main curator of the First National War. Museums and memorials. This is a graphic war. The cheekbones were lost, and the entire face was submerged. The jaws were completely destroyed. When human bones collided with 8mm machine guns, shrapnel, there was no soldiers who could not eat, drink or even speak. Competition. As terrible as amputation, soldiers who lose their faces lose their identities. Fred Howlett Albee, a surgeon in the First World War, wrote, "It is normal for an inappropriate person to feel like a stranger in their world. Feeling like a stranger should be absolute hell." However, hope lives in the hospital next to the blue bench. Harold Gillis first used the new reconstructive surgery technique to not only restore the faces of soldiers, but also restore a normal state in their lives. The Army medical team at the beginning of the war was sent to the Western Front. An ear, nose and throat specialist served in a field ambulance and received training from a dentist and the most cutting-edge doctors in plastic surgery. Cart said, "Plastic surgery was invented centuries ago, but it has not been used on a large scale. These reconstructive surgeons have discovered new ways to treat deformities, and anesthetics have become better." After returning to England, Gillis persuaded the chief surgeon of the army, opens a facial injury department at Cambridge Military Hospital. In June 1917, after a large number of victims swept across the site at the Battle of the Somme, Gillis opened the Queen's Hospital in the southeast. Sidcup, a suburb of London, has more than 1,000 beds for patients who need facial reconstruction. The soldiers arrived without chins, noses, cheekbones, or eyes. The pilots and sailors were severely burned. They all suffered the psychological trauma of being hidden in the mirror. For a long time, the problem faced by plastic surgeons is the high infection rate of patients with skin grafts and open wounds. Gillis countered this by developing a tube shaft, which uses the patient's skin and tissues to ensure continuous blood flow to the graft. Help recovery area. For a sailor who burned the front of his face from an explosion during the Battle of Jutland, Gillis cut the living skin and tissue at a quarter of an inch from the patient's chest to form a tube that remained connected to the healthy end and place it through the injured face of the patient. A tube was formed to solve the infection problem. 2 weeks later, the graft took root in the raw meat. The surgeon cut the tube and opened the patient's nose and throat. Gillis took out the cartilage under the patient's 8th rib from Lieutenant William Sprickley and placed it on Sprickley's forehead. Gillis left it there for 6 months, then took it down to build a new nose. The surgeon put on the leather taken from the lieutenant's forehead. Like most patients, Sprickley underwent multiple surgeries and spent nearly 4 years in Queen's Hospital. Gillis formed a multidisciplinary team of surgeons, nurses and even artists to help her patients. The sculptor created photos of the wounded before they were injured, and the skilled surgeon Henry Tonks was a professional artist who painted portraits of injured patients to document their condition. Surgeon and facial surgeon Gillis could not persuade American Verazdid Kazanjian to meet him in London. Kazanjian was born in Armenia. At the age of 16, he went to night school and became an AIM and then came to the United States.